With 137 tanks, Germany currently has the second largest tank tech tree in War Thunder, just behind the Russian tech tree at 145. But surprisingly, there are still a large number of German tanks that still need adding to War Thunder, including some major vehicles. In this video, we will be looking at some of these vehicles and why I think they should be added to War Thunder. The first tank we're going to look at is one that I've been excited about for a long time, and is actually related to the VK3002M that was recently added in the Drone Age update. I am of course talking about the VK3002D, the alternative Panther design proposed by Daimler-Benz. Both the VK3002M and the VK3002D were prototypes for what would later become the Panther tank, with the VK3002M by the MAN company eventually being chosen as the preferred design to be taken forward. But that's not to say that the VK3002D wasn't any good, and I think it would be an interesting addition to War Thunder. Also, my apologies in advance for the lack of photos. Unfortunately, there just aren't really any pictures of the Daimler-Benz design, unfortunately, so we just have to deal with that as we can, I suppose. The basic story behind the Panther prototypes is that after facing T-34s for the first time in Operation Barbarossa, the Germans quickly found them to be superior in most aspects to existing German designs, which they found to be as a result of mainly three design choices. 1. The use of sloped armour, allowing thinner plates to give greater protection than an equivalent plate of flat armour. 2. The use of gun barrels that overhung the front of the tank, meaning they could be longer and achieve greater muzzle velocities. And 3. The use of wider tracks and large road wheels, giving considerable advantages off-road. So having discerned the main advantage of the T-34, Daimler-Benz and MAN were contracted to build a prototype for a new tank, which as we already know led to MAN's design becoming the Panther tank. The MAN design generally seems to have had more in common with previous German designs, sticking with petrol engines, primarily using sloped armour for the frontal plate, and retaining a centrally mounted turret, while adopting wider tracks to decrease its ground pressure and using a new torsion bar suspension system. The Daimler-Benz design, on the other hand, while not a direct copy of the T-34, does seem to have taken a lot more inspiration from it, with the use of a diesel engine, rear-mounted transmission, and a frontally mounted turret that somewhat resembled a T-34 turret. However, it retained external leaf springs as used on previous designs for its suspension, and it used narrower tracks which negatively affected its ground pressure figure. So having talked about the history, let's look at the stats of the VK3002D. The main armament of the VK3002D is the 75mm KWK-42 as used on the Panther in-game, giving an in-game penetration of 173mm at 500 metres with APC-BC shells. In addition to this, it also has two 7.92mm MG34 machine guns, one mounted in a coaxial position and one in the bow. So armament wise, there's nothing special about this vehicle, but there's nothing bad about it either. Moving on to the armour, the Daimler-Benz design had an armour thickness of 16 to 80mm, which is about the same as the MAN design. However, there were some minor differences. For example, the rear hull is 50mm versus 40mm on the MAN design, and the turret, while being the same thickness, is slightly more sloped, with the front being 80mm at 30 degrees in the Daimler-Benz design, while the MAN design has 80mm at a 12 degree angle. The turret sides are similar, again being 45mm but sloped to 30 degrees in the Daimler-Benz design versus 25 degrees in the MAN design. Mobility is more of a concern, as while the top speed is about the same as the MAN prototype at 34 miles per hour or 55 kilometers an hour, and it is capable of climbing slightly higher grades, 40 degrees versus 35 degrees, due to the narrower tracks, it has a higher ground pressure figure, which could cause obvious issues with mud when going cross country. And as mentioned before, the VK3002D used a leaf spring suspension system, which unless I'm mistaken isn't as good for smoothing out the ride at higher speeds as compared to the torsion bar suspension system. But it did have the advantage of reducing the tank's height as compared to the MAN prototype, with the VK3002D being 2.69 metres tall versus the VK3002 being about 2.88 metres tall. Though this is at the cost of the Daimler-Benz design being longer, with that design being about 9.01 metres long versus the MAN prototype at 8.62 metres. Width was broadly the same, with the D design being about 10 centimetres wider. Lastly, the crew complement is 5, with a driver, bow machine gunner, gunner, loader and commander. So having looked at the stats, it does seem like it's a pretty decent tank. So why wasn't it actually chosen to continue development over the MAN design? Well, of course, eventually the Germans had to make a decision on whether to use the Daimler-Benz design or the MAN design. And at first the Daimler-Benz design actually seemed to be on top, with Hitler preferring it, and an order for 200 tanks were actually made. However, a committee responsible for choosing between the designs preferred the MAN design, for a few reasons. The obvious ones are the better ground pressure figure, wider tracks, and the longer operational range. However, the main issue against the Daimler-Benz design was the turret. You see, while the Germans accepted the need for overhung barrels, they were still worried about the gun hitting objects when being traversed or being driven into the ground when going downhill. The MAN design somewhat offset this by having a centrally mounted turret, lessening how much overhang there would be, while the VK3002D went with a frontally mounted turret, causing more overhang than the Germans were comfortable with. Secondly, and far more importantly, while MAN and Daimler-Benz were contracted to build prototype vehicles, they were supposed to be fitted with a turret designed by Rheinmetall. Now, I don't know if Daimler-Benz didn't read the contract properly, whether they felt they could do a better design or something else, but for some bizarre reason they went and built their own turret, which, like I said, they weren't supposed to do. And as a bonus, they designed the tank with a turret ring too small to fit the Rheinmetall turret, meaning a major redesign would be needed in order to fit it. Bear in mind, the tank was needed to be put into production as soon as possible, so there wasn't really any time to produce new turrets or redesign the tank. So all in all, this basically killed off any chance of the VK3002D being chosen, and the orders already placed were cancelled, leading the VK3002M to go on and become the Panther we know and love today. So as we can see, it wasn't a bad tank, but due to the realities of war, it had no chance of being chosen. But of course, this isn't actually an issue in War Thunder. So where would the VK3002D go in War Thunder? Assuming it wasn't a premium, I think it could go at 5.0, the same battle rating as the VK3002M, and maybe you could even folder it with the VK3002M. Overall, I would very much like for the VK3002D to be added to War Thunder, and I think it would be a very cool alternative to the Panther, allowing players to play a tank that could have easily become a much more well-known tank, if only for a few different decisions, and I think it would just generally be a cool tank to play. The second German tank we're going to look at is actually a French tank, but modified extensively by the Germans. That tank being the Flammwagen UF Panzerkampfwagen B2F, which I'm just going to call the B2F from now on, which is basically a French Char B1 bis tank with the 75mm hull gun removed and replaced by a flamethrower. There are a few different variants of this, but I am suggesting that the last variant should be the one that is added. Stats wise, it should be mostly the same as the regular Char B1 bis in the French tank tech tree, though a little bit worse in its tank fighting capabilities, as the 75mm hull gun has better penetration than the 47mm gun, while the flamethrower will of course only really work against exposed vehicles. Armour should be mostly the same, though as you can see there is some sort of armoured vision block added to the right of the driver position, which is where the gunner would sit. Presumably it would have the same thickness as the driver position, but I haven't actually found any solid confirmation on this. It should also be noted that unlike the Churchill tank recently added, the B2F had its fuel tank mounted on the rear of the tank, which removes the need for cumbersome trailers like with the Churchill, and while I'm not sure if it's armoured or not, because the fuel tank is external to the B2F, the crew would be protected in the event that it is hit. Max speed would remain the same at 17 miles per hour or 28 kilometers an hour, while the crew complement would also remain the same, consisting of a driver, commander, flamethrower operator, and a fourth crew member who is labelled in-game as a machine gunner, but I think it's more accurate to say they are a radio operator. Now this would probably be one of the better German flamethrower tanks to have in War Thunder, as most other German flamethrower tanks seem to lose their main armament, making them practically useless on the battlefield. The B2F also has the advantage of heavy armour, which along with its turret armament means it can still function as a gun tank, which to be honest is probably how it's going to be played 99% of the time. I would personally place this vehicle at a battle rating of 2.0, lower than the 2.3 for the regular Char B1 bis, mainly on account of its heavy armour and lack of 75mm hull mounted gun. No doubt it would be a battle pass or premium vehicle, though if added to the regular tech tree, it could possibly go between the Panzer IV E and F, but like I say, I doubt this would happen. Overall, I think this would be the best German flamethrower tank that could be added to War Thunder, and I think it would be a very good addition to War Thunder. The third German vehicle that I would like to see, and preferably as a bit of a priority, is the Stug 4 tank destroyer, which was essentially a Stug 3G superstructure mounted onto a Panzer IV H or J chassis. This was actually the second design attempt in a combination of these two vehicles. The first design had not gone ahead, primarily because there wasn't really a need for it, but also because the design had introduced significant changes, such as sloped armour and thicker side armour, which was enough of a change that it would take too long to put into production for it to be feasible. Things changed when the Alket factory producing Stug 3s was heavily bombed, massively decreasing Stug 3 production. Thus the Stug 4 plan was dusted off, though simplified to the point of only taking the existing Stug 3 superstructure and putting it onto the Panzer IV chassis with minimal modifications. To be honest, I don't know why they couldn't just put their efforts into making Jagdpanzer IVs, but perhaps the factory for the Jagdpanzer IV was already at capacity. The main differences come about due to the Panzer IV being longer than the Stug 3 superstructure, necessitating an armoured box position for the driver left of the gun, and the remaining space is just covered by a bolted on plate. For the most part, stats are the same, with the armament being the same 75mm Stug 40 length 48 gun as on the Stug 3, and one 7.92mm MG34 machine gun on the roof. Armour is the same on the superstructure, with a maximum thickness of 80mm, though I believe the box position for the driver is less at around 50mm, though I haven't been able to find confirmation of this, though obviously if that is the case it would be a massive weakness to the vehicle. Interestingly, the Stug 4 also has the Saukopf or Topfblender mantlet, a mantlet that was better for bouncing shots and something that the Stug 3s in game currently lack. Also, as this is based on a Panzer IV chassis, it's likely that the rear hull armour would be reduced from 53mm to 20mm, though again I haven't found confirmation of this. Mobility should be broadly the same, with a max speed of 40km an hour or 25 miles per hour, and the crew complement remains the same at 4, consisting of a driver, gunner, loader and commander. Now, having heard about the vehicle and its similarities to the in-game Stug 3G, you might be wondering why I would want it in War Thunder as a priority. Well, the reason is that the Stug 4 was included in the initial list of German tanks to be added to War Thunder all the way back when the German tank tech tree was announced. Indeed, it appears to be only one of two tanks still not added, with the other being the Stug 3C, which might simply not have been added as it was deemed too similar to existing vehicles. Bear in mind, the tech tree was announced on the 12th of October 2013, and closed beta testing began on the 4th of December 2013. So presumably the vehicles in the list must have been a fair bit along with regards to being added to the game or being developed to be added to the game, which makes me wonder if the Stug 4 is nearly finished or actually finished and ready to be added, but is being kept either as a premium or battle pass vehicle, or maybe just for a rainy day where Germany isn't getting many vehicles. Regardless, I would like to see the Stug 4 added, if only to mark off the last major German vehicle from the initial announcement that hasn't been added yet. Personally, I think it could go at battle rating 4.0, the same as the existing Stug 3G, and while it won't exactly set the world on fire, I would like to see this vehicle finally added to War Thunder. So having looked at these three vehicles, I would like to hear in the comments which of these vehicles you would like to see added to War Thunder first. While I personally think the Stug 4 would be the easiest to add, I would quite enjoy trying out the VK3002D, as well as comparing it to the VK3002M and to the final Panther design that went into service. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and hopefully you'll join me for the next video. I've been Tyranno, and I'll see you next time.